Welcome to the Effective Literacy Podcast. On today's episode, we have part 2 of our interview with Alexandra Güílamo, during which we learn more about transfer and about how to look at student data and research data to implement best practices for our multilingual students. In the article, you have a lot of science-based recommendations specifically about transfer and translanguaging. Can you talk through a couple of those recommendations and really explain what it might look like in the classroom to really empower the educators?
Yeah, and thank you for bringing up the secondary world, because I think our secondary educators are ignored a little bit too often when research comes out. I think one of the most brilliant things that we can do, particularly at the secondary level, is really have multilingual anchor charts. Multilingual anchor charts is one of those things that allows students to say, here's a key word, a key core concept, and here's how it looks in a range of languaging sort of forms. Here's how I might say this concept if I were speaking in my community or at my home, right? We have to introduce and allow slang to be one of those connections that students make. Here's how I would say it if I were saying it in Spanish, in English. Oh, that's the way you say it in Panama. This is the way I say it in the Dominican Republic, right? So being able to bring all of those sort of like terminologies that we have across countries, across academic communities and social communities together into one place so that students understand we are talking about this content area or this phenomena in this class, in this language. But these are the words for the same thing so that you can language this in other places, in other spaces, regardless. Because you're learning about it here, but now you'll have the words to talk about it in other places. Being able to connect that for students is so absolutely critical. I think another piece is really, so one of the things that I share is this idea of opportunity and scaffolded literacy tasks for students to meaningfully engage, right? So we have students that are absolutely brilliant bilinguals. And they may be at different stages of their language journey when they are engaged in a specific reading task. For many of our schools, one of the things that we've had to begin doing is really thinking about what does mastery of doing this reading skill, this reading task, look like? What does it look like for the standard itself? But then what might that look like for a student who is very early in their language journey? What does it look like for a student that is got a few years under their belt for their language journey? And what about a student that's towards the end of the journey? These are very different realities. And how will students sort of be allowed the opportunity to use language in ways that are accessible to them to show what they know as they engage in reading tasks throughout the day? For most of our schools, they're beginning to explore this idea of how do we do sort of multi-level exemplars so that we're clear on how language might look, how language choices might look different as students show what they know about a given reading task. And what might students be ready for in kindergarten that's way above grade level standards, but because they already know it and are able to do it in the partner language or in Spanish, they're ready for it now. Let's not wait. If they can transfer that knowledge like digraphs, let's let them do it. It then frees up instructional time for us to give students more time where they may need it, particularly when it comes to the naughty English vowels and the patterns that are a little bit less discrete for students to be able to understand and be able to apply in a range of texts throughout the day.
Everything that you're saying makes so much sense. And I'm also thinking that puts a lot of responsibility on the teacher for really knowing their students and knowing where they are in that language journey. And it kind of moves us past, I'm dating myself, but really thinking back to like that one language support or that one graphic organizer that we provide that says, this is helpful for me to give to my English learners, right? And what you're saying looks different in my mind from that one sentence frame.
It looks very different. And we name that and we call that out, right? Having a one size fits all for a group of students that are anything but one size fits all is not necessarily what we intended when we talked about scaffolding literacy and language, right? But for our schools, they need a little bit of support in that. In part, we do ask teachers to really rethink the way they plan instruction. These are scaffolds that absolutely have to exist very intentionally, very strategically, and it's not just based on a test. It is based on really looking at student work, really looking at student language choices, understanding the way in student work you can see the influence of students' other languaging, right? Right there, even in an English sample, I can see Spanish coming through. And how do I notice that as the teacher as something that is as important for me to know as whether or not students got the right or wrong answer? And so we go through those processes with our schools as well. But we can't put all of the burden and all of the responsibility and onus on the part of the teacher. One of the things that we've called our districts to do is really provide the support that our teachers need to say, listen, you have two very isolated parties, particularly like with foundational skills, right? You have two very isolated scope and sequences. How do you help teachers reconcile that using the research? How are we going to very intentionally layer these two scope and sequences so that there's an opportunity to transfer those things that are transferable and put that right in there very intentionally so that teachers know what to do? They shouldn't have to figure that piece out on their own while they're trying to plan daily instruction. And so it's a twofold, right? How do we support teacher planning? But also, how do we make a call to our district leaders to also say, if you want dual language, if you want this program, because we recognize it is what is good and right for kids, then we have to make sure that it is prepared with the supports that our kids need because they're good and right for kids. And a reasonable and fair scope and sequence around what it looks like to teach certain skills in a given language or to transfer certain skills across languages is something that is good and right for kids that your teachers deserve.
Yeah, that jumps me ahead to a question that we were going to ask about coaching teachers. But now I'm really thinking that it's not just about, of course, coaching the teachers, right? That if we're going to make these big shifts in our programs, then it's not up to the individual teacher, but that the partnership between teacher and district and really thinking about what does the program look like and what are the best practices in a whole big picture rather than just digging right into the classroom.
Yeah, so at times we have a pilot teacher that just really wants to get started, and we can use that classroom to show the district, look, this works. This is the more effective path. Here's the research, but look, it's working right here in your district, in your backyard. We need to expand this, but we need to do it very strategically. At other times, we need to address the district level first, particularly the beliefs. I say that because most often We want dual language. We believe in dual language. But in our blind spots, we still default to, testing season is coming. We better stop everything and test prep in English. They've got to get that English because the test is going to be in English. And when our backs are against the wall and it really matters, the question is, will districts continue to lean into the research of what gives our emergent bilingual and dual language students a learning advantage in reading in two languages? Or will we default to our old ways, right? And so making sure the district takes that out of their blind spot and that we recognize that these beliefs may have at one point served us. They may have. I don't know. I don't think so. But they may have. But they aren't serving us now because this sort of panic, crash English to get you ready for a test, that's not the way learning has happened for quite some time. We've known that for quite some time, right? And so sticking to the research and making sure that our leaders really understand where their blind spots are, they plan for those blind spots, and they support teachers, and in turn that teachers are producing results that prove what is working in classrooms for dual language and emergent bilingual students is absolutely critical.
It's so hard to break that system and break that, break those bad habits, right?
It is, because a lot of them are just blind to us. We don't even realize that we do it, right? Like we don't realize simple things like when we look at student work, we just grade it for what's right and wrong. Many of us came up in an educational system like that, so we don't even think about that. We don't think about looking at the way language is being used and what patterns are emerging so that then we can use that to plan our next round of dictados. But that information is there. And when we work with schools and when we coach our schools, we just have to think about what's the best entry point for the context in which we're serving. And what are they ready for? And that's where we build them, right? We've got to meet every school and district and system where they're at, just like we expect our teachers to meet every kid where they're at.
So that does take me to your book from 2019, The Coaching Teachers in Bilingual and Dual Language Classrooms. Let's imagine I'm a teacher who's listening to this podcast and I'm thinking, oh my gosh, this is everything. This is everything that I want to know about, that I believe. Can you take us through some of the pieces in that book that might help me to also not only make some good decisions in my classroom that I know are good for kids, but then also be able to go to maybe some of my district leadership and say, okay, so here's what I've been working on, what do you guys think of this?
I love it. So
just going rogue a little.
Right? Hey, just really quickly, I wanted to show you this. This happened to come across my desk. So I think stage 2 of the coaching cycle is really critical, right? Part of what we really share with our schools and coach our schools to be able to do is really think about how the planning process might need to look different in a dual language context and how it can help us coach teachers more effectively to be able to shift the way we think about planning from just content only, reading only, to what do my assessments say? And do I have assessment data in Spanish and English that I can use to plan more effectively? Fundamentally, our coaches know we've got to have Spanish and English data side by side. We're not going to look at Spanish only. We're not going to look at English only, because that is an incomplete view of what our kids can do as readers. Yes, it may be happening in different spaces, but it's the same kid, right? And so how do we plan from a much more holistic view? The other piece that I think is really critical in terms of the coaching cycle is what strategies do we plan for, and how did we determine those strategies as the right and most effective match for our students for a given set of objectives. That's where a lot of our teachers have had an opportunity to sort of build capacity upward, right? Because they're implementing strategies, and the outcome of that strategy for kids, like what kids are doing, what kids are saying, what kids are showing in their work, is absolutely having the right impact. And they're able to articulate how they picked that strategy, why they picked that strategy, what moves led to students being so successful as biliterate readers, writers, and critical thinkers. It then sort of opens the door and the opportunity for coaches to say, given this goal, could this strategy work in another place? A lot of our coaches are coming across strategies like El Dictado, La Talara, LEAs through teachers, and then they're able to turnkey those or really get more information so that they're able to integrate that into what they understand to be really effective practice for emergent bilinguals and dual language students.
So I want to circle back to something you said in your article, The Science of the Bilingual Reading Brain. You say, have the scientists who've researched the monolingual reading brain looked at how bilingual brains excel? I don't know, which I think we've just talked about that, right? And so I'm curious, who is being left out of the research and why?
So I think right now we are at a place as a country where we know we have a literacy emergency. There are a lot of different things happening in literacy classrooms across the country, and some set of norms for how research translates into practice and makes its way into the classroom had to happen, right? In an effort to do that, states are now listening at a policy level to what the research says and making huge sweeping shifts policy-wise on what districts have to do. The question that I always ask is, who are these policies for? Who are these policies for? And are those the same populations that are right there cited in the research that you're using to justify the policies? Because in many states, what we're seeing is that research where the study was for and focused on a gen ed population are being used to make policy decisions around emergent bilingual and dual language populations, which are putting our programs really at a crossroads, right? We have bilingual researchers. We have researchers that have published a ton of material, are so incredibly knowledgeable in terms of biliteracy development, the intersection of literacy and language, whose research was focused on populations that match our program models. But that's not the research that's necessarily making its way to policy conversations in many of the states that we serve. And so you have teachers that now maybe teach Spanish, and they have to attend all English reading trainings. And they're like, but we don't teach English literacy. And the messaging is, well, it's the same for everybody. But it's not. If you dig into the research and you really focus on population validity, research that is focused on the population that we are making decisions for and about, there are some pieces that are the same, and some pieces like adding oracy and transfer to the absolute essentials to the formula for biliteracy instruction, that's have to. But oracy and transfer don't necessarily make its way into the research for gen ed populations, and logically so, right? I think our states and our districts need to be mindful of who they are serving and who they're making decisions for, and making sure that research that is valid for that particular population and is represented by the best voices, the most effective voices for that population is absolutely vital. And those are the voices right now that are sadly being left from the national conversation. And I think it's having huge consequences policy-wise that then trickles down into curriculum, instructional minutes, assessments, et cetera, et cetera.
We were having this conversation in our last meaning making episode about this whole theme of that multilingual learners are this second thought, right? While districts or states are adopting policy or districts looking at curriculum, and it's like, and then what about, right? Rather than bringing them in the same conversation rather than an afterthought.
And the crazy thing is that for some of our districts, I mean, they serve 40, 50, 60% immersion bilingual and dual language students. So trying to retrofit and answer a policy to that vast number of students, I mean, that critical mass of your population that are counting on you to get school right, for them to have access to literacy. It's still something that humbles me and drives me to continue digging and researching and finding out what works for our schools and meeting with leaders, even though I'd rather just be in classrooms, right? Like watching learning happen. But I think it's something that drives me because there's still so many places where we're seeing, here's what we do for the gen ed population, and now let's retrofit it for all these other groups, rather than saying, is this the research that we need to be listening to? And if not, what do we need to add to the table so that we have a better understanding? And in doing so, we can make more quality decisions that are going to be more effective for our students.
You know, I'm going to make a tie-in to what you were talking about with the coaching and stage 2 of the coaching, right? You say that as teachers, we need to look at the data side by side.
Yes.
But as policy adopters, as curriculum adopters, we need to look at the research side by side and make sure that all of our students are represented in that research.
Victoria, I'm such a big fan. Because you know, sometimes we do have schools that are like, let's throw away that research. I'm like, no. We cannot throw it away. There is value in that research. There are things that we know in the emergent bilingual and dual language world because of monolingual researchers. Let's not throw it out with the bathwater. Let's just understand where the gaps are, where we still see that the question, how do we give students a biliterate reading advantage, isn't quite being answered. And let's add the research that we need to be able to fully and holistically be able to answer that question. And that second piece is where we're struggling. And that's where you see Alexandra write articles, because the question keeps coming up too much. And so then we just have to respond more holistically so that there's a broader understanding of some of these pieces and where it fits into the bigger picture of literacy instruction and biliteracy instruction.
Because it's a giant, bigger picture that we all need to look at as educators, right?
Yeah.
And we have a new kindred spirit with you. Yeah. Like we're on the same page. And I think that one of the things Anna and I always talk about is that as educators, we constantly need to be educated ourselves. We need to ask ourselves those big questions that you've brought up those questions today. And the other thing is that if we are teachers of reading and writing, we have to be reading and writing ourselves. And so the important question for today, right? Maybe
the hardest one.
I know the hardest one.
No, I've got to go back to my chart to remember.
What are you currently reading or writing? And it could be professional, it could be personal, children's literature, anything. We just want to hear it.
So I am reading a number of things, but I will tell you one of the things that I've had to do as I consume all of this research is find ways to just simplify things and slow down my brain just a little bit. So I will tell you, I write in this every single day. It's my gratitude journal. And I think it's important for us as we continue this fight, right? We encounter so many different challenges, so many different setbacks, that taking a moment to think about the positive and what we're grateful for and the shifts and the moves that we have made is absolutely vital. When I'm done with that every morning at sunset, I'm reading a lot of neurocognitive science, a lot of research around language networks and the role that memory plays in language networks. Because one of the questions that has come up is, A, what is the role of memory in transfer, which sort of leads educators to how young is transfer really effective? What does the research say? What is the implication on that? And for different students with different abilities and unique individualized needs, what does that mean for them? And language networks, how do they form? And how many encounters, how many experiences do they have to have in order to solidify that new language pattern, feature, structure into the network, to integrate it, right? So that then we know it's ready and primed to transfer. Once it's fully integrated into the network, we can transfer it. They have it, right? And now we can hook something to that. A similar pattern, feature, rule, we can hook it to that. We want to know what that critical point is. And I need to understand it from a research perspective so that then I understand it from a practitioner's perspective. Because when we're working with 5-year-olds and 6-year-olds and 7-year-olds, it doesn't often look the same way it looks like in the research, the original research that you're reading. I'm reading a few different things. I'm reading a couple of kid books with my kids. I'm reading some research around neurocognitive diversity, language networks, and memory. And then I'm doing my thankfulness journal every single day to keep things simple.
Thank you, Alexandra, for joining us today. It's such a pleasure. And as I've already said, Anne and I have a new kindred spirit. We want to thank you for listening and being here with us. We are the Effective Literacy Podcast. For more information and to get access to all the resources, the articles and books that Alexandra has written, please visit our show notes at multilingualliteracy.org and make sure to subscribe to our podcast wherever you may listen. Thank you.